They say the land always wins in the end, but nobody ever tells you how patient the land can be. The first sound I heard that morning was not thunder rolling across the valley. It was the high-pitched scream of tires spinning against soaked dirt just beyond the old oak tree at the edge of my farm. I looked up from the tractor, wiped the rainwater from my gloves, and watched a pearl-white sport utility vehicle lean lower and lower as its wheels churned dark mud into the air. The engine roared. The tires kept spinning. The vehicle did not move an inch. Standing nearly 50 yards away, I rested one boot on the tractor step and quietly took another sip of coffee. I had imagined this exact moment more times than I could count, but when it finally happened, it was strangely quiet. There was no cheering, no celebration, only the smell of wet soil, fresh-cut grass, and diesel drifting across 200 acres that my family had cared for long before anyone had ever dreamed of building a homeowners association nearby. Then the driver's door opened, and Karen Mitchell climbed out, carefully balancing herself to avoid the deepest mud while staring directly at me, as though I had somehow caused the laws of nature to change overnight. Her expensive shoes were already covered with splashes of brown clay. She raised both hands in disbelief before shouting across the field, "What did you do to my road?" I almost smiled. My road. Those two words explained everything that had happened over the previous 6 months. The muddy track beneath her vehicle had never been a road. It had always been part of my farm, planted every spring, harvested every fall, and restored after every season by my family. Karen simply decided that driving across it every morning was more convenient than using the public county road less than half a mile away. She had repeated that shortcut so often she eventually convinced herself it belonged to everyone. I did not answer her question. Instead, my eyes drifted toward a bright orange warning sign standing only a few feet ahead of her front bumper. It was impossible to miss unless someone had already decided not to look. The reflective letters were still clean despite the rain because I had installed the sign the afternoon before. Beyond it stretched a freshly completed drainage trench running neatly across my own property, exactly where the county-approved engineering plans required it to be. Rainwater flowed steadily through the channel, carrying away excess runoff that had been destroying my topsoil for years. Everything about it was legal. Everything about it had been carefully measured. Everything about it had been documented. Karen simply chose to ignore all of it. As the drizzle softened into a light mist, another vehicle pulled onto the county road overlooking the farm. Then another. Within minutes, a small group of curious neighbors stood beside the fence watching the scene unfold. Some recognized the trench immediately. Others stared at the spinning wheels and slowly began putting the pieces together. None of them knew the entire story yet. None of them knew how many mornings I had watched fresh tire tracks slice across newly planted fields. None of them knew how many warning signs had disappeared, how many fence posts had been knocked over, or how many polite conversations had ended with Karen laughing as she drove away. Looking across the soaked field that morning, I realized something my father had tried to teach me years earlier. You can argue with stubborn people forever, but eventually the truth finds a way to slow them down all by itself. My name is Cole Harrison, and I have never believed that a farm truly belongs to one person. We simply take care of it until the next generation is ready. My family has worked this land for more than 70 years, and every acre carries a memory that cannot be measured by a property appraisal. My grandfather planted the first cornfield with a borrowed tractor that barely stayed running. My father spent countless weekends digging drainage ditches by hand because he believed healthy soil deserved as much attention as a healthy family. When I inherited the farm, I promised myself I would leave it better than I found it. Every sunrise started the same way. Before the town woke up, I walked the fields with a cup of black coffee, checking fence lines, inspecting irrigation, and listening to the sounds that had become part of my life since childhood. Red-winged blackbirds perched on fence posts. Wind moved through rows of corn like slow ocean waves. The scent of damp earth mixed with fresh hay reminded me why I never traded this life for an office downtown. I was 42 years old, and although I respected modern farming technology, I still believed the most valuable tool on any farm was paying attention. Healthy crops always left clues before problems became visible. Water always followed the lowest ground. Tire tracks always told a story. My father used to kneel beside fresh ruts after heavy rain and run a handful of soil through his fingers before saying, "Protect the soil, and it will protect you." At the time, I thought he was talking about farming. Years later, I realized he was talking about something much larger. Respecting the land meant respecting boundaries, patience, and consequences. The farm covered just over 200 acres, stretching from the county road to a shallow creek lined with old oak trees. One corner bordered a newer residential neighborhood managed by the Homeowners Association. For years, we coexisted without much trouble. I waved at neighbors when they walked their dogs near the fence. Some even bought sweet corn directly from me every summer. Most people appreciated that farms were working properties, not public parks. That quiet understanding slowly disappeared after Karen Mitchell became president of the association. Convenience started replacing courtesy. A narrow strip along the edge of one field suddenly became somebody's unofficial shortcut. At first, it was only one set of tire tracks cutting across the grass. Then another. Eventually, the path widened until sections of healthy soil became compacted hard enough that rainwater no longer soaked into the ground the way it should. Every deep rut trapped water, damaged young crops, and forced my equipment to work around unnecessary obstacles. Repairing the damage took hours that nobody ever noticed because by the next planting season the field looked normal again. That was the strange thing about farming. When you did your job well, people rarely saw the effort. They only noticed when something went wrong. Standing on my tractor that rainy morning while Karen stared at her stranded vehicle, I knew every inch of mud beneath those spinning tires had a history she had never bothered to learn, and every lesson waiting ahead had actually begun many seasons before she ever decided my family's farm looked like the fastest way home. Karen Mitchell had a remarkable talent for turning convenience into entitlement. She did not see my farm as someone else's livelihood. She saw it as an obstacle that should quietly adjust itself to fit her schedule. As president of the Homeowners Association, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed every decision she made automatically became reasonable. Around the neighborhood, people often described her as organized, efficient, and determined. They were not entirely wrong. Karen kept immaculate meeting notes, answered emails within minutes, and never missed an opportunity to remind homeowners about community standards. The problem was that she slowly stopped recognizing where those standards ended and someone else's property rights began. The first time I met her was during a neighborhood gathering a few years earlier. She introduced herself with a friendly smile, complimented the view from my farm, and casually mentioned how much easier traffic would flow if residents could cut across the edge of my field instead of driving the extra half-mile to the county road. I smiled politely and explained that active farmland was not designed for daily vehicle traffic, especially during planting season. She nodded as though she understood, thanked me for my time, and walked away. I assumed the conversation was over. Instead, it had only begun. A few weeks later, I noticed a single set of tire tracks crossing the corner of the field nearest the subdivision. At first, I thought someone had become lost. Then I recognized Karen's white sport utility vehicle one morning as she drove straight across the grass with complete confidence before disappearing toward the neighborhood entrance. When I waved to get her attention, she simply smiled through the windshield and continued driving without slowing down. Soon the pattern became routine. Every weekday morning, the same vehicle appeared just after 7:30. Every afternoon, it returned using the identical path. Before long, other drivers began following the tracks she created. Some were delivery vans. Others belonged to visiting relatives or neighbors who assumed the route must be acceptable because the president of the association used it herself. Fresh grass disappeared beneath packed soil. Young corn plants near the edge of the field never had a chance to grow. Deep ruts collected rainwater after every storm, forcing me to steer tractors around damaged sections during planting and harvest. I replaced broken wooden stakes marking the property line more than once, only to find them leaning over again days later. The most frustrating part was not the damage itself. It was the attitude behind it. Whenever I politely mentioned the problem, Karen laughed softly and insisted everyone was simply saving time. "It is only a little dirt," she once said while standing beside her spotless vehicle. "You have plenty of land." Those words stayed with me far longer than she probably intended. To someone driving home from a board meeting, it looked like a shortcut across an empty field. To me, every square foot represented months of work, careful planning, and respect for the ground beneath my boots. She never asked permission because she had convinced herself she no longer needed it, and each fresh set of tire tracks quietly confirmed that more people were beginning to believe the same thing. The tire tracks became so predictable that I could almost tell the time without looking at my watch. At 7:30 every weekday morning, Karen's white sport utility vehicle appeared at the corner of the property, bounced over the shallow rise beside the fence, and rolled straight across my field as though she were driving down a paved county highway. The sound of gravel disappeared the instant her tires reached the soil, replaced by the dull crunch of compacted earth and crushed grass. Every pass left another scar behind. After a week of dry weather, the tracks hardened into deep ruts that collected dust. After rain, they filled with standing water that lingered for days. Those puddles looked harmless from a distance, but they slowly weakened the root systems of the young corn growing nearby. Healthy soil depends on air and drainage. Heavy vehicles destroy both. One Saturday morning I found 2 broken fence stakes lying flat beneath fresh tire marks. They had not rotted. They had simply been driven over. I replaced them with thicker treated posts and attached bright reflective markers so nobody could honestly claim they had failed to see the property line. By Monday afternoon, one marker leaned sideways while another had disappeared completely. I never accused anyone without proof, so instead of arguing, I installed motion-activated trail cameras along the edge of the field. They were the same type many farmers used to monitor wildlife. Small, weatherproof, and almost impossible to notice unless someone knew exactly where to look. The footage told the entire story. Karen crossed first almost every morning. Sometimes she slowed slightly near the fence before accelerating across the field. Within minutes, another vehicle followed the same path. Delivery vans, contractors, visiting relatives, and even a landscaping trailer eventually adopted the shortcut because the tire marks made it look official. It was amazing how quickly repeated behavior transformed private property into something people assumed belonged to everyone. One afternoon, I drove over to the neighborhood entrance, hoping another calm conversation might finally solve the problem. Karen was standing beside the clubhouse speaking with several homeowners about flower beds and seasonal decorations. I waited until the meeting ended before politely asking if we could discuss the continued traffic across my farm. She smiled exactly as she always did, glanced toward the distant fields and answered, "Cole, everyone is just trying to get home a little faster. You are making this much bigger than it really is." I explained that the repeated traffic was compacting soil, damaging crops, and creating drainage problems that cost both time and money to repair. She folded her arms, looked toward the neighborhood road, and casually replied, "You have 200 acres. Surely a few tire tracks are not hurting anything." Before I could respond, she climbed into her vehicle, waved through the open window, and drove away. Instead of using the public road directly in front of her, she turned onto the same worn path across my field while I stood there watching. My own warning signs passed beside her driver's side window without earning so much as a glance. The trail camera mounted nearby captured every second. I returned to the farm before sunset and reviewed the newest footage inside the equipment shed. Every date, every timestamp, every vehicle, and every license plate quietly filled another folder on my computer. Karen believed I was losing an argument. She never realized I was collecting a complete history of choices that would eventually explain themselves far better than I ever could. By then, I had already tried every reasonable solution I could think of. I called the county sheriff's office after another week of vehicles crossed the field, and the deputy who stopped by listened carefully while I showed him the damaged rows, the broken fence stakes, and the growing collection of trail camera footage. He watched several clips without interrupting before removing his hat and explaining that repeated trespassing on private property could become a legal matter. But because there was an ongoing disagreement involving neighboring property owners and no immediate threat, much of it would likely be handled through civil enforcement unless the behavior continued after formal notice. It was not the answer I wanted, but it was an honest one. The following day, I mailed certified letters to the Homeowners Association and directly to Karen, including photographs, dates, copies of the survey, and a polite request that all vehicle traffic across the farm stop immediately. I even enclosed an aerial map clearly marking the public county road that added less than half a mile to the drive. Weeks passed without any meaningful change. The green return receipt arrived in my mailbox proving the letters had been delivered, yet fresh tire tracks appeared almost every morning. Karen's sport utility vehicle remained the first one through the field more often than not. Instead of becoming more careful, some drivers became even bolder after seeing the warning signs. They seemed to assume that because nobody had physically stopped them before, nobody ever would. Every pass compacted more soil and widened the path another few inches. One afternoon, I walked the damaged section with a local agricultural extension specialist who had advised farmers throughout the county for years. He knelt beside the deepest rut, pressed a soil probe into the ground, and quietly shook his head. The repeated traffic had compressed the earth enough that water could no longer drain properly after heavy rain. Unless I restored the drainage, standing water would continue damaging both the soil structure and future crops. His recommendation was simple: install a properly engineered drainage trench before the next rainy season. It was exactly the kind of improvement my father would have made without hesitation. That evening, I spread survey maps across the kitchen table, reviewed elevation measurements, and marked the lowest point where runoff naturally collected after storms. The solution was surprisingly straightforward. A shallow drainage channel following the natural contour of my own property would protect the field, improve water flow, and reduce erosion for years to come. I contacted the county office, confirmed the permitting requirements, and hired a licensed excavation contractor to review the plan with me. Every measurement stayed entirely within my property line. Every stake was placed according to the approved survey. I also ordered bright reflective warning signs stating that drainage work was underway and that vehicles should remain on the public road. The signs were intentionally larger than necessary because I wanted there to be absolutely no confusion. As I watched the weather forecast later that night, meteorologists predicted several inches of steady rain arriving the following weekend. I glanced once more at the trail camera recordings showing months of ignored warnings and unnecessary shortcuts before closing the laptop. Karen believed the problem was simply a stubborn farmer refusing to share a convenient path. I understood something she still did not. Farms are built around water, gravity, and careful planning, and when you finally decide to respect all three at the same time, the land has a remarkable way of reminding everyone else where they truly belong. The excavation crew arrived just after sunrise on Friday, 2 days before the storm was expected to reach our county. Their equipment rolled slowly across the edge of the field, while I walked beside the foreman carrying the approved survey, permit paperwork, and engineering drawings. Every stake had already been placed according to the measurements I had confirmed with the county. The drainage trench would follow the natural low point where runoff had collected for years, protecting the crops instead of allowing water to pool across the compacted soil. Nothing about the project was unusual for working farmland. The diesel engines hummed steadily while the excavator carved a clean, shallow channel through the earth. Fresh soil carried the rich smell that always follows a new cut into healthy ground, and the damp breeze pushed loose blades of grass across the freshly graded surface. Before the crew packed up, we installed bright orange reflective warning signs at every obvious vehicle entry point. Each sign clearly stated that drainage improvements had been completed, that soft ground was present beyond the marked area, and that all unauthorized vehicles must remain on the public county road. I even added temporary reflective posts beside the trench so anyone approaching after dark would immediately recognize the change. There was no hidden obstacle, no surprise waiting beneath the surface, only a properly constructed drainage channel performing exactly the job it had been designed to do. Saturday evening, the rain finally arrived. It started as a gentle shower tapping against the metal roof of the equipment shed before growing into several hours of steady rainfall. I stood beneath the open doorway watching water flow naturally through the new trench instead of spreading across the field the way it had every previous season. For the first time in years, runoff moved exactly where it was supposed to go. By sunrise the following morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind clean air, dark clouds drifting east, and fields glistening beneath the first rays of sunlight. The drainage system worked beautifully. Water flowed through the channel while the surrounding soil remained noticeably firmer than before. I climbed onto my tractor to inspect the repaired section, feeling quietly satisfied that months of planning had solved a farming problem that had existed long before the Homeowners Association appeared. Then, just after 7:30, I heard the familiar sound of an engine approaching from the subdivision. I did not need the trail camera to know who it was. Karen's white sport utility vehicle appeared at the edge of the property exactly as it had dozens of mornings before. She slowed only briefly near the first warning sign, then continued forward without changing direction. Her tires rolled past the reflective posts, crossed the grassy approach, and entered the section where rain had softened the surface beside the drainage channel. From where I sat on the tractor, I could see the entire sequence unfold almost in slow motion. The front wheels slipped off the firm track into the saturated soil bordering the trench. The vehicle settled gradually, not with any dramatic crash, but with the quiet certainty that heavy machinery and wet ground always obey the same laws of physics. The tires spun harder, throwing small sprays of mud behind them while the vehicle refused to move forward. I remained exactly where I was, watching from a respectful distance. Every warning sign was still standing. Every survey stake remained visible. Every permit rested safely inside the folder beside me. Nothing unexpected had happened. The land simply responded the way it naturally does when someone ignores clear boundaries, clear warnings, and the simple reality that a working farm is never a shortcut. Karen pushed harder on the accelerator as though determination alone could convince 6,000 pounds of metal to ignore saturated clay. The engine grew louder while the wheels spun deeper into the soft ground beside the drainage trench. Mud fanned out behind the tires in smooth arcs before falling back into the same ruts that had been carved by months of unnecessary shortcuts. I climbed down from the tractor and walked only as close as I needed to, stopping well outside the disturbed soil. There was no reason to rush. There was no emergency. Water continued flowing quietly through the drainage channel exactly as it had been designed to do. Karen stepped out, looked at the trench, then back at me with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. "You planned this," she said. I shook my head gently and pointed toward the bright orange warning sign standing only a few yards away. The reflective letters were impossible to miss in the morning sunlight. Beside it stood the temporary safety posts we had installed after completing the excavation. The county permit folder rested beneath my arm together with the engineering drawings and inspection paperwork. "I planned the drainage project," I replied calmly. "The route your vehicle took was your decision." She glanced toward the sign for the first time since arriving, then looked across the field where several neighbors had gathered along the county road after noticing the commotion. Nobody laughed. Nobody shouted. They simply watched in silence as the situation unfolded. One of the neighbors quietly remarked that he had seen the construction crew working all weekend. Another remembered the certified notices I had mailed weeks earlier asking everyone to stay off the field. Their conversations drifted across the cool morning air while birds settled once again on the fence posts bordering the property. Karen reached for her phone and requested roadside assistance, then called the county sheriff's office, convinced someone would force me to remove the trench or somehow declare the entire situation my responsibility. While we waited, I retrieved the trail camera mounted near the fence line and reviewed the newest recording. The footage showed every warning sign standing in place before her vehicle entered the field. It showed her slowing briefly beside the reflective posts before choosing to continue anyway. It showed the tires leaving the established edge of the property and moving directly into the softened area beside the drainage channel. Nothing in the recording suggested hidden hazards or unexpected obstacles. It simply documented another deliberate decision. About 30 minutes later, the same deputy who had previously visited the farm arrived and greeted both of us politely. He listened without interruption while Karen explained her version of events. Then he walked the site carefully, examined the warning signs, reviewed the county permit, inspected the completed trench, and finally watched the trail camera footage from beginning to end. His expression remained calm throughout. After returning the camera to me, he turned toward Karen and quietly explained that the drainage work appeared to be properly permitted, clearly marked, and entirely located on private property. He also reminded her that entering private farmland without permission after repeated written notice carried its own consequences. The words were spoken respectfully, without accusation, but they carried more weight than any argument I could have made myself. As the recovery truck slowly approached from the county road, I looked across the field where fresh water flowed smoothly through the new channel, protecting the crops my family had spent generations caring for. For the first time in months, the deepest tracks across the farm were no longer created by someone ignoring boundaries. They had become a reminder that patience, preparation, and respect for the land will always travel farther than entitlement. The recovery truck operator spent nearly 20 minutes attaching heavy-duty recovery straps before the sport utility vehicle finally eased back onto solid ground. Nobody celebrated. The only sounds were the steady hum of the winch, birds returning to the fence line, and rainwater continuing its quiet journey through the drainage trench. Once the vehicle was safely on the county road, the driver completed his paperwork and explained that the recovery would be billed directly to the vehicle owner. Karen stood silently beside the muddy tire tracks that had brought her there in the first place. The confidence she carried during every previous shortcut had been replaced by careful silence. Later that afternoon, I received a call from the Homeowners Association requesting copies of the certified letters, the survey map, and the county permit for the drainage improvements. I provided everything without hesitation because I had organized every document weeks before the first shovel ever touched the ground. The trail camera recordings, mailing receipts, engineering drawings, inspection approval, and photographs were all arranged in chronological order inside a single binder. There was nothing dramatic about the evidence. That was exactly why it was so effective. Every document quietly confirmed the same story from a different angle. Over the following week, the association's attorney contacted me to discuss the repeated vehicle traffic across my property. After reviewing the survey, the recorded notices, the camera footage, and the county inspection records, the attorney acknowledged that the farm had always been clearly identified as private property and that the drainage work had been completed entirely within my legal boundaries. Shortly afterward, the association distributed a formal notice to every homeowner reminding residents that private farmland was never to be used as a shortcut under any circumstances. Temporary signs were also placed near the subdivision entrance directing all traffic to remain on the public county road. Something changed almost immediately. The fresh tire tracks stopped appearing. The grass along the edge of the field finally had an opportunity to recover, and after several weeks the compacted path began blending back into the surrounding pasture. Young corn plants that would have been crushed during another season were finally allowed to grow undisturbed. One evening, while checking irrigation after sunset, I paused beside the drainage trench and watched clear water flowing smoothly through the channel after another brief summer storm. The soil surrounding it remained firm, healthy, and exactly as my father would have wanted. A neighbor from the subdivision walked over carrying a small paper bag filled with tomatoes from his garden. He apologized for assuming the shortcut had been acceptable simply because he had seen others using it for so long. We stood beside the fence talking for nearly half an hour about farming, weather, and how easily small habits can become accepted when nobody questions them. As he prepared to leave, he smiled and said he had never really understood why farmers cared so much about a few tire tracks until he saw everything that happened afterward. I looked across the field where the morning sunlight had finally begun drying the last patches of mud and realized the biggest victory had nothing to do with one stranded vehicle. The real victory was that people finally understood the difference between convenience and respect, and that lesson would protect the farm long after every tire mark had disappeared from the soil. Several months passed before I realized how completely the farm had returned to sounding like itself again. At sunrise, I no longer heard engines cutting across the eastern field. Instead, the familiar chorus of meadowlarks, wind moving through healthy rows of corn, and the distant hum of irrigation pumps filled the morning air the way they always had when my father walked these same acres. The drainage trench blended naturally into the landscape as fresh grass rooted itself along the banks, and every heavy rain proved the project had accomplished exactly what it was designed to do. Water flowed smoothly through the channel, the soil remained healthy, and the repaired section of the field produced one of the strongest harvests I had seen in years. The deep ruts that once sliced across the property slowly disappeared beneath new growth until only I could remember where they had been. One afternoon I found myself standing beside the old oak tree at the edge of the field, the same place where I had first watched Karen's vehicle come to a stop in the mud. Looking across the land, I could hardly imagine that the entire conflict had started because someone believed saving a few minutes mattered more than respecting another person's property. The Homeowners Association eventually installed additional directional signs leading residents toward the county road, and the unofficial shortcut vanished from everyday conversation as though it had never existed. Even the neighbors who had once followed the tire tracks began stopping at the roadside to wave instead of driving across the field. A few occasionally bought fresh produce from the farm stand during harvest season, and our conversations became surprisingly friendly once the misunderstanding had finally ended. One cool autumn evening, Karen herself pulled into the gravel entrance beside the public road instead of approaching from the old shortcut. She remained inside her vehicle for a moment before stepping out and walking toward the fence. Her expression was calm, almost thoughtful. She quietly acknowledged that she had allowed convenience to cloud her judgment and admitted she had underestimated how much repeated traffic affected working farmland. It was not a dramatic apology, but it was sincere enough for me. I thanked her for taking the time to stop by, and we spent several minutes discussing the drainage improvements, soil conservation, and why farms operate differently from residential neighborhoods. When she drove away using the proper road, there were no fresh tire marks left behind, only clean gravel leading back toward town. As the sun settled below the western hills, I rested my hand against one of the sturdy fence posts my father and I had installed years earlier, and remembered the lesson he repeated throughout my childhood. Protect the soil, and it will protect you. Back then I thought he was talking only about farming. Now I understood he was also talking about patience, preparation, and quiet confidence. I never needed to raise my voice, block anyone's path, or seek revenge. I simply respected the land, followed the law, documented the truth, and allowed every careful decision to speak for itself. Standing there beneath a sky glowing with the colors of another successful harvest, I realized justice rarely arrives all at once. Sometimes it grows the same way healthy crops do, one careful season after another, until the people willing to ignore every warning finally discover that the shortest shortcut can become the longest lesson of all.